Hey there, everyone. Thank you for joining me at the Chattanooga Film Festival. I'm Bentley Little. With me is legend Joe Bob Briggs. Joe Bob, how are you doing today?
Oh, good. I'm happy to be here.
That's
Glad
good
to be in Chattanooga.
Absolutely. Now, this is your third time at the Chattanooga Film Festival.
Second time.
Second time.
I wish it was three. I have such a good time.
Absolutely. Now, you here for the film festival, you are presenting a thing called Redneck Night. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, last year I did a thing called the South in Film, which is a thing I developed years ago at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, where we tell the whole history as perceived, the whole history of the South as perceived by Hollywood in film. And as part of that, I eliminated certain states as don't deserve to be considered part of the South. One of those is West Virginia. Mm-hmm. One of those is Kentucky. One of those is Missouri. Mm-hmm. So we didn't do any hillbilly films. We didn't. I mean, if you didn't stand with us in 1861, don't call yourself Southern today, right? So we didn't do hillbilly films. We didn't do riverboat films. We didn't do any Kentucky moonshine films, you know. And so this year, what we're doing is the history of the redneck in films. And it's a little bit more than that. It's not just a history of the redneck in film, it's the history of the redneck, why we call them rednecks, where they originated from, who's the first original redneck in the history of the world, you know. And so we get the moonshine in there, we get the hillbillies in there, we get the people that we neglected last year, and we tell the whole development of the redneck in film, which is very important because rednecks saved Hollywood's ass about 20, 30 years ago because they ran out of villains. Mm-hmm. They ran out of people to use as evil influences in movies because you couldn't do Indians anymore. You know, the Nazis were old hat, you know, and so who was left? You know, the redneck. You know, it's like because nobody ever got in trouble for treating a redneck as a bad guy in a movie, and especially when they started. You know, you couldn't even use Russians because they were making these international movies that would appear. You know, they'd premiere all over the world at the same time. They didn't want to piss off the Russians. They didn't want to piss off the Chinese. They didn't want to piss off the Germans. You know, what can you use? Rednecks. And so this whole tradition of the redneck in the movies was sort of like perverted by Hollywood in terms of all you had to do is put a guy with a Southern accent in a movie, and suddenly, why is he raping that woman? Well, you don't have to explain that because he's a redneck, you know. And so there was this. So part of it is like Hollywood uses rednecks, and then the other part of it is at the same time, the movies that Hollywood is sort of ignoring are creating the redneck hero and redneck chic, and rednecks are becoming like popular again, and they're even wannabe rednecks, you know, people in the North that want to come down and be a redneck. And so, I mean, there's like, this may be a surprise to you, there's like 40 redneck reality shows.
What?
You know, and so, you know, rednecks are like hot again. So anyway, we go back to, you know, ancient history and bring the redneck into the present. In this presentation.
Now, do you think, as you mentioned, you know, the Hollywood started perverting the concept of the Southerner and the redneck, you know, into a negative stereotype? Do you think with the rise of the film industry in the Southeast, that with these people interacting with Southerners and rednecks and whatnot more often, that is helping stem the tide of the negative stereotype?
No, rednecks will never be cool. No, because I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. Like at the Indianapolis 500 in 1986, Michael Eisner, the head of Disney Studios, was there. And they were announcing all the celebrities leading up to the race. And one of the celebrities they announced was Jim Varney. Mm-hmm. Only they didn't call him Jim Varney. They said, Ernest is in the crowd. And the crowd went crazy, you know, more so than any other celebrity that was there. And so Michael Eisner goes, who, what, who, Ernest, who, what? And they said, well, no, there's this ad agency in Nashville, and they do these local commercials, you know, where he talks to his neighbor Vern, and he says, you know what I mean? And Eisner says, what commercials for what? And they said, he's got over 1,000 clients at Cardin and Cherry in Nashville. He goes, okay, sign that guy up. Okay, so Ernest goes to camp. Ernest saves Christmas. So when Ernest joins the Army, slam dunk Ernest. I mean, they made 9 of those things. They made 9 of those things. They made millions and millions and millions of dollars on Ernest. Now, did Michael Eisner ever say, man, am I proud of those Ernest movies that we made? No, he didn't. No, he didn't. They never even claimed those movies. You know, that was like, oh, that was something they were doing over here. It made all this money for the studio. So, no, the Redneck franchise will never be cool. TV executives that do those hillbilly reality shows, they don't brag about those at the You don't ever get an Emmy for making one of those. You know, no, rednecks won't be cool, but they'll always be with us.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you were born in Texas.
Yeah.
And then you ended up going to school in Vanderbilt. Is that right?
Right.
And what did you go to school for at Vanderbilt?
At Vanderbilt, I was an English major, and Vanderbilt, when I was there, was very traditional place, very old school. And I thought when I got to Vanderbilt, I thought I was a hell of a writer. I thought I was a great writer. I worked at the newspaper in Little Rock, Arkansas, and everything. And then I went into the English department at Vanderbilt University, and it's like, whoa. You know, they had me writing 3 major papers a week and everything, and they were rough. And it was a tough school. I mean, I'm glad I went there.
Right.
But I was one of the poor students because I was on a full scholarship. I was on a sports writing scholarship. And most of the people there were rich and prep school kids from the East and everything. So it was a big education. But at the time I was there, it was so Old South that they were actually having a debate about whether they should limit the number of students that were accepted from out of the Deep South states. I mean, they were saying, you know, they were the school of the Southern gentlemen,
right.
You know, and they were like saying, we're getting too many, you know, students from Europe, and we're getting too many students from the West Coast, and we get too many students from New York, and the Vanderbilt family keeps sending all these Vanderbilts down here. You know, they were like upset about it. There was a whole school that thought that we keep it Southern, keep it Southern. You know, of course today it's like like one of the. It's like Stanford, you know. It's like no one even knows it's Southern. People don't even know where it is.
Right.
You tell them it's in Nashville, they don't know. Yeah, well, I thought that was in New York, you know. So, yeah, that was a big part of my training. I worked on the newspaper, and we printed it up here in Murfreesboro. So twice a week we'd spend all night putting out the paper in Murfreesboro. So yeah, I was all over Tennessee when I was at Vanderbilt.
And so you went from Little Rock to Nashville. When did the character or persona of Joe Bob Briggs start really coming to its own?
Well, my first real job, I got a job at the Dallas Times-Herald in Dallas, and I became the. Actually, I was writing a book, and I was finishing the book, and I needed a job where I didn't have to run off and get on planes all the time. And the film critic job was open at the Times-Herald. And I said, can I just do this till I finish this book? Because my friend was the entertainment editor. Yeah. And so I start watching every film that comes out. And this was in the 80s. I'm watching every film that comes out. And I hated like 90% of them. But the only ones I liked were the foreign films, because once a foreign film gets to Dallas, Texas, that's 1 out of 1,000 films that were made overseas. So that's going to be a good film.
Right.
You know what I mean? And the films that debuted at the drive-in, so what I call drive-in films.
Right.
And so I started reviewing those, and no one else was reviewing them. I mean, at that time, nobody reviewed those films. And in fact, I would call the distributors and say, when are you going to show this film? I'm a critic. I want to review it. We don't show our films to critics, And finally, I befriended Roger Corman, who's a great legendary B-movie exploitation filmmaker. And most of what I developed in terms of the column was called Joe Bob Goes to the Drive-In.
Right.
And most of my rules of, drive-in movies came from Roger.
Right.
And I just popularized the concept into the 3 Bs: blood, breasts, and beasts. All movies had to have blood, breasts, and beasts.
Right.
And there were other like refinements that I got from Roger, but basically that was it. And I'm serious. He had formulas for the way he made movies. And if you were a first-time filmmaker and you went to have a meeting with him, he would tell you, exactly what.
Right.
He has a great deep voice, and he would say, now I would like to see a motor vehicle chase within the first 10 minutes. I would like to see at least 3 instances of breast nudity within the 86-minute running time. 2 of those instances could be the same girl. However, you need at least 2 actresses for the 3 breast nudity scenes. And he would go on at length about, he was like, I would prefer that the movie be 82 minutes or less. And the reason for that is it's the difference between 4 cans of film and 5 cans of film. So the shipping costs become, approximately 20% less if you have an 82-minute film as opposed to an 83-minute film. And he would go on and on and on. He had the formula down. And so I became a friend of Roger. I went out there, toured his studio. It's his studio. It was a lumber yard in Venice, California. I sort of developed the column around the idea of he's the king of the exploitation film. I'm the champion of exploitation movies. There was only one other guy reviewing exploitation movies when I started. It was a guy named Bill Landis, a gay journalist in Manhattan, and he would go down to 42nd Street, and he would review the audience and the film, and so it was often the same films. So we got to know each other because the same films would play in grindhouses on 42nd Street, and they play in the drive-ins of the Deep South. And so I did the drive-ins, he did the grindhouses, and we were the only 2 guys around. John Waters wrote a book that celebrated some of the movies, but really that was it. There was nobody, they were considered beneath the contempt of film reviewers. I mean, today, if any exploitation movie comes out, there's 150 reviews on the internet the first day. It's cool to review exploitation movies, but at the time it was, considered. In fact, I thought every week I thought I was going to be canceled. I mean, I didn't think the editors would let it go.
Right.
And it became popular enough that by the time editors don't read what's in their paper. Right. So by the time it got popular, it was too big to kill, so that's how I got the system. But.
And how did you make the transition from the newspaper side into making drive-in theater, the reviews?
Well, I got fired,
okay.
and so I got I wrote a column. I was reviewing the movie. I'm trying to remember the movie, The Last Dragon, and as part of the review, I would frequently get off the subject, and it was at the time Michael Jackson's song "We Are the World" had just come out, and I did a parody version of it called "We Are the Weird," and it was considered racist by a politician in Dallas who said it was making fun of black people and starving African people and whatever. And so they did a protest at the paper, and it was on TV and everything. And the editor of the paper canceled the Joe Bob column, but said he wanted John Bloom, my alter ego, to remain and write my other column, which was a more serious journalism that I did. And I said, no. I said, if you're firing Joe Bob, then John Bloom is resigning in solidarity with Joe Bob. So I was out of a job, and I had to find other things to do. And I started appearing in public. People had invited me to appear at various places, and so I went to Cleveland. This guy invited me to Cleveland to do a show. And I'd never been to Cleveland, and I thought, I don't know anybody in Cleveland. If I bomb in Cleveland, no one's ever going to know.
Right.
And so I go to Cleveland, and I'm on the front entertainment page of USA Today. And I'm like, oh boy, this is not going to be sneak into Cleveland and sneak out. And so I did the first show, and it was pretty horrible, but the audience was kind,
Right.
you know. And then I started doing these shows, and then they asked me to do a show on or be a guest on the Movie Channel, which was a sister network of Showtime. And I went and did that show, and they invited me back every week. They never really hired me. They just kept inviting me back every week and every week and every week. And after 11 years, that was a show.
Right.
You know, and so that was my first show. And then I did. I was off the air for like 2 or 3 months, and then I like took the exact same show over to TNT and did it a show called Monster Vision on TNT for 4 or 5 years. So that's a short version of how, you know. A lot of stuff happened.
Right. Now, on your show, you had a very unique rating system and some wonderful euphemisms. Can you tell us about that, and then tell us how you came up with them?
Well, it's the 3 B's: blood, breasts, and beasts. I mean, I would talk about, you know, the number of breasts, the number of dead bodies, the amount of kung fu, and you know, the drive-in totals. I'd been doing that for years in the newspaper column, you know, and then we just adapted it to TV, and people always loved the drive-in totals. It was one of those things that I invented, and then I was a prisoner of it. I had to keep doing it. It's actually a pain in the ass sometimes to watch a movie and be counting everything the whole time you're watching the movie, you know. But we had that on the Movie Channel, and also the Movie Channel show was called Joe Bob's Drive-In Theater, and then we also had that on Monster Vision on TNT.
Now, you kind of relished the B-movie and exploitation films. There are other groups that ended up kind of attaching themselves to those movies, like Mystery Science Theater 3000. Do you ever feel like they were not treating it with the respect or the admiration?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, there are a lot of hosts, late night hosts, horror hosts, B-movie hosts, whatever, and Mystery Science Theater did their thing. You know, almost to a man. Whether you're talking about Elvira or Gilbert Gottfried or Rhonda Shear or whoever did those, almost to universally, they were making fun of the movie. I celebrated the movie.
Right.
My show was really the opposite of all those other shows. Even though we would be compared, and many of them, they're very talented. I'm not putting them down, but my philosophy is, we're going to celebrate the movie. As long as this movie doesn't talk down to the audience, and as long as it's not boring, we're celebrating that movie. You know, it can be bad and we'll still celebrate it. But a lot of hosts who talk about B movies don't seem to know the difference between a great B movie and a bad B movie.
Right.
I mean, they don't really look at the genres and study what it is. I mean, there's a huge difference between those movies that Roger Corman made and, say, a company like Troma. I mean, a company like Troma can be a lot of fun, but, you know, they made, I mean, 95% of those movies are really bad movies, and you know, they're good companies and they're bad companies. They're good filmmakers and bad companies within the genres. What makes the genres interesting is the hardcore fan base. Like a horror fan doesn't want to just see what came out last week. He wants to see every horror film ever made. He's watching the horror films from 1932 with just as avid an interest as the films that came out last week. Can you say that about somebody that's into, you know, comedies? Not really. No, you know. So the genre fan base is what makes it so fun. You're talking to your family when you're talking about these movies. You know, they're more knowledgeable than you are, because people think I'm very knowledgeable about these films. There's guys that never leave their apartment. You know, they've watched a whole lot more of them than I have. You know, so yeah, I always celebrated the film. I think that was the big difference.
Now, recently, last decade or so, B movies and grindhouse movies have come back. Tarantino and Rodriguez did Grindhouse, and then we had Asylum, with has had great success with the Sharknado series, and then there's other movies that are so bad they're good, like The Room. How do you feel like those kind of movies fit into the spectrum of your bread and butter, for the movies you love?
Usually, if the movie is made with tongue in cheek, or with a person who sets out to make a genre cult movie, usually fails miserably. If you start out with a sort of tongue in cheek attitude, or if you start out with a superior, you feel superior to your audience. A lot of people try to make horror films, and they're not fans of horror films themselves, or they don't know the conventions, and they don't enjoy the film themselves. So they're trying to make the film for what they consider a substandard class of person who's going to come to the film and watch it. Those tend to be horrible experiences to watch those. Quentin Tarantino is a true believer, is a true fan of these films, of not just American genre films, but Asian genre films and genre films from other cultures. And so he tends to come from, he's very derivative. He steals stuff all the time, but he comes from a true place of, he knows emotionally what made this genre cool to begin with, and that's why his films are so powerful. Okay. We start out tonight in my presentation with "Bring in the Gimp." Right. That's our first, because I want people to say, now, how do we know these guys are from the South?
Right.
And how do we know these guys are rednecks? They don't say they're rednecks. They don't say they're from the South. We know, right? We know, Somehow it became, there's code. There's code in those images that we know when he says, "Bring in the Gimp." Oh, he is from the mountains. Yes. That guy is from the mountains. Even though the film's in L.A., we know he's from the mountains.
Oh, yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier 42nd Street, and I know that when the 42nd Street redevelopment happened, that impacted you to some degree.
42nd Street was so much fun when it was sleazy, and then they rehabbed all the theaters. They turned them into Broadway houses again, and now it's the Lion King is on 42nd Street. It's like it used to be. There was one theater. In fact, it's the theater where the Lion King is. I don't even know the name of the theater, because the name we called it was Always 3 Kung Fu Hits, because that's what it said on the marquee. Always 3 Kung Fu Hits. And that for years, for, I don't know, at least a decade, that's what it was. You could walk into any Times Square theater at any time of the day or night and see an exploitation film. And in many cases, a film that wouldn't be shown in the rest of the country. For example, all the very fashionable Italian films from the late 70s and early 80s, Dario Argento films and things, those were kind of disguised as American films when they were first released. They didn't really want you to know that it was an Italian film. And the Italian filmmakers, if you'll notice, they would put credits that were all English names at the end of the film, even though the film was made in Italy and it was dubbed and everything. And they would do things like they put Kellogg's cornflakes on the table just to make people think that it was America. Of course, I think they were amazed when 20 years later, people are coming to interview them in Italy, and they're saying, "No, I didn't make that film. What are you talking about? No, that's an American film." And they say, "No, you're famous. You are now famous." Right. I think Dario Argento was probably blown away when the first interviewer came to see him and said, we think you're great. Yeah. He's like, "Really? You know that we made those in Italy?" But those would play in Times Square. They would also play in the Deep South. And so it was just a great. It was actually a big part of our First Amendment history, because in the 60s, what passed for porn in the 60s, which today would not be considered porn. It was much too soft to be considered what's considered porn today. But Times Square is what made it possible. That's where it started, 1964, 65. They had these films called Roughies, we supposedly promised rough sex.
Right.
It wasn't very rough. They didn't show any sex, you know. But the idea is that it was a forbidden thing. The nudist camp film started there, you know. So as far as a First Amendment thing, Times Square is where it happened.
Right. Now, you mentioned, a lot of the Italian exploitation films and whatnot, and you have the passion for the redneck character. Does the redneck character go worldwide, or is that purely an American idea?
Oh, no. They know in Germany what a hillbilly is, and a hillbilly, an Appalachian hillbilly is not a Swiss mountaineer. Because there's Swiss mountaineers movies too, but that's not the same as an Appalachian hillbilly, and people know the difference, worldwide. In Japan, they know all the redneck films. So, I mean, America has an advantage. American filmmakers have an advantage in that our culture is really well known. And not just Western culture, Southern culture is well known from the films. They learn about it from the films. That's why when you have tourists here who you say, boy, that guy really doesn't get it. He's looking for something that doesn't exist. Well, it's because his whole education is from the South in film. He's coming here and he's expecting to see things that haven't been here for 50 years.
Right.
Because, films lag behind the history,
Right.
So, but yeah, we're well known.
Okay. And now, with the increase of digital media, people creating their own films, putting them on YouTube and Vimeo and Hulu and Netflix, all making media much more easily to digest, do you think, or do you see the redneck trope coming back in independent films? Do you see it being twisted to positive, negative? I mean, has it changed it at all?
Well, you mean as far as the new filmmakers and the number of filmmakers out there? When the technology for making films got really, really cheap, I thought that was a great thing. If for nothing else, the principle of if you have 100 million monkeys typing on a typewriter, you end up, one of them does Hamlet, right? And so I thought just for the sheer volume of movies, we would have a lot of great movies. It hadn't really worked out that way because they start making the movie before they go to film school, and so the movies, they're not art directed and they're not, they use their friends as actors. And I meet with these young filmmakers and say, why did you use your non-acting friends as actors in your movie? And they say, well, I live in the middle of western Kansas, and we don't have any actors there. I said, do you have a community college there? Yeah. They have a theater department. They have actors there. They have people who are going every day and studying how to be actors. I said, go get them. Tell your friends you can't be in my movie. And is there any reason that in this scene in a bedroom, there's a dirty sock over in the corner? He's like, well, yeah, because we didn't have any money, so we had to. I said, you have to art direct your bedroom. Right. It's like, so, all of the mistakes and all of the bad things in filmmaking, they always say, well, we didn't have any money. All the things that are wrong with your film have nothing to do with money. They don't cost anything. You didn't fix the script. That didn't cost you anything. Right. So all these excuses that we didn't have money, that doesn't really cut it. They still need to go to school somehow or get a mentor or something and know about how to do shots and how to set up scenes and and how to mostly 3-act structure and screenwriting things. And so we haven't had this great outpouring of a huge number of great films made with daddy's money or made with the money I made working at 7-Eleven or whatever. Right. And I thought we would. What I hope happens is that now that education gets cheaper, so you can go and you can do seminars on the internet and you can learn things, right. You don't have to spend $80,000 a year going to Harvard, or USC or NYU. In fact, those NYU filmmakers that I meet, or Tisch. We go to Tisch. Yeah. They don't say NYU anymore. I don't know what Tisch is, but I go to Tisch. I'm an NYU filmmaker. you know, most of them, I've watched their short films. I've watched their student films. And they're no better than the ones at Florida State.
Mm-hmm.
And they're no better. There used to be two film schools, NYU and USC. Mm. And now there's probably 80 film schools where they can compete at any level, And so there's no excuse. There's no longer any excuse. If you want to be a filmmaker, you better have all your shit together,
right.
because you can get it. You don't have to pay a whole lot of money, and you don't have to spend a whole lot of money to make a good film. So, so I hope that the genres improve, and they're twisted, and they're genre combining. I love combined genres,
right.
But a lot of young filmmakers, what they try to do instead is, I love the horror movies of the 80s, so I made an 80s horror movie. Well, don't make an 80s horror movie. Make a horror movie that has 80s conventions in it, but then twist it and make it 2016. Right. And so, so yes and no. Yes and no. The opportunity's there. So far, people haven't really taken advantage of it.
Okay. And now, here at the film festival, there's a variety of movies. Do you plan on seeing some of the other movies? And if so, which ones have you excited?
I want to see the Penn Jillette movie.
Director's Cut.
Yeah.
I helped crowdfund that one. I'm very excited about it.
Okay. But usually I get so busy. Last year I got so busy that I only saw one or two films. But I'll just wander in and out, whatever's showing whenever I have a few minutes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for joining us today. That was Bob Briggs. Now, we're going to be covering some more exciting events and some more interviews. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a great day.